Hello, my name is Mandy Gibson. I'm from the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention at Griffith University in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. And I'll be presenting part of a larger study examining the relationship between cultural connection and suicide mortality rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. I'm presenting today from Yagara Jarana, the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, as the traditional owners and custodians. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their enduring connection to this land, and acknowledge the harms caused by actions of historic and continued colonisation which have sought to diminish that connection, the impacts of which are seen in the disproportionate burden of suicide borne by First Nations communities today, which I'll be presenting on in this presentation. Similar to other Indigenous and First Nations communities globally, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people die by suicide at a significantly higher rate than other people in Australia, with young people particularly overrepresented. While the age-standardised or whole-of-population suicide rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is over twice as high, First Nations young people under 15 die by suicide at almost 8 times the rate of their non-Indigenous peers. So despite being only 6% of our state's youth population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people make up 1 out of every 4 young suicides in Queensland. Unfortunately, research and government reporting has shown similar stark gaps of Indigenous overrepresentation in suicide mortality data in Australia for decades. While there is a clear need for quality data to track and monitor these trends and rates and hold governments accountable, there is little evidence that such reporting has led to better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. In fact, it's been more recently argued that continuing to report on these gaps without exploring or presenting potential protective patterns contributes to dominant deficit approaches to Indigenous suicide prevention and the assumptions that higher rates are inherent or intractable, and particularly hinders identifying effective strengths-based solutions based within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and communities. In fact, there's little evidence at all of effective suicide prevention models and programs for First Nations communities. A bit over a year ago, as part of our work as a World Health Organization Collaborating Centre, we conducted a systematic review of all suicide prevention programs for all First Peoples globally. And in that process, we found only 4 peer-reviewed initiatives which reported improvements in suicide-related outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Obviously, there's many reasons contributing to this limited evidence, but a key factor is the different suicidal trajectories and protective and risk factors experienced by First Peoples, which are often unmet or misunderstood in many traditional or mainstream models and services. For example, here in Queensland, we found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people who died by suicide, as compared to non-Indigenous young people who died by suicide, were less likely to have reported symptoms of mental illness or communicated their own suicidal intent. And as severity of mental illness symptoms and reported ideation or attempts are primary indicators within traditional risk screening and triaging models, it would suggest that First Nations young people experiencing suicide risk are less likely to be recognised and supported. So it's not surprising that compared to non-Indigenous young people who died by suicide, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people who died by suicide were less likely to have ever received any mental health treatment or psychosocial support. Also, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people more broadly in community experience higher rates of general environmental risk factors for youth suicide, such as exposure to family and friend suicide or exposure to poverty or attention from police or corrective services. And we know that Indigenous young people who experience these risk factors experience higher suicidality risk than other Indigenous young people who are not exposed to these risk factors. Which means we know that we're going to need strategies to build resilience at the whole of community level to promote protective factors in order to reduce Indigenous youth suicide mortality rates, and that we can't rely only on models that seek to identify which First Nations young person or young people need support as compared to the rest of community. Further, Indigenous young people often experience risk factors for suicidality that are absent, or at least not central, within traditional models of triaging and screening. Most notably here, of course, are the experiences of racism and discrimination, which research continues to demonstrate as strongly associated with Indigenous suicidality. Some studies have reported racism to have a stronger relationship than many traditional risk factors, such as issues with employment or ill health, With such pronounced effects of culturally specific risk factors on suicide, there's a clear need to examine Indigenous culturally specific protective mechanisms, such as cultural practices and connectedness, to inform preventative approaches. And stepping back from the literature and data for a moment, and back to the initial acknowledgement of country. While it is widely accepted that the suicide disparities today are the result of actions of historic and continued colonisation, that has not proportionally informed our approaches to research, policy or practice, such that if community dispossession and cultural dislocation are presumed to be causal factors here, then community empowerment and cultural connectedness should logically be examined to alleviate these effects and inform our intervention designs. And that is the overall question behind this research project, is our indicators of community cultural connectedness associated with lower suicide rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. As there was no examination of cultural indicators and Indigenous suicide mortality in Australia, this work builds upon the studies by Chandler and Lalonde on cultural continuity. The researchers were child mental health clinicians who found that young patients and clients experiencing suicidality were less able to identify connections between past and current self-identities compared to young people experiencing other mental health challenges. They theorised that the impact of disrupted sense of continuity on suicide risk extended beyond individuals to whole communities and cultures. So feeling part of a culture whose ways and bonds stretch into the past and produce positive projections into the future is protective against suicide by providing a reinforcing hold to connect to the future self during periods in which self-identity fluctuates, such as adolescence. And this is proposed as the reason why the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous suicide rates are widest during adolescence. So that background reinforcement and connection to future self is disrupted by actions of historic and continued colonisation, particularly colonial governments which supplant Indigenous governance and limit the positive future conceptualizations of indigeneity into the 22nd or 23rd century. So the cultural continuity studies found that not only were Indigenous youth suicide rates lower in communities with greater language use and cultural facilities or land claims and land governance, but they also reported a dose effect whereby more cultural connectedness indicators was associated with lower suicide rates. They also found that Indigenous youth suicide rates were not related to other general community-level risk factors such as income or distance from services. However, they didn't examine if the protective effects of cultural continuity and connectedness were maintained specifically within areas with higher community-level risk factors, or indeed if cultural connectedness buffered the impact of community-level disadvantage and the social and environmental legacies of colonisation. In an Australian context, we're quite limited in the community-level cultural data we have access to by comparison. We do, however, have the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey, which is completed every 6 years by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents and asks questions about community engagement, housing, cultural activities and social networks. Due to the very high risk of identifying individual respondents, the Bureau of Statistics does not release small area data. However, our friends from the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling have used aggregated survey responses to these items on the NATSA survey and benchmarked and validated them against data from the census in order to create reliable small area estimates of social and cultural indicators for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations at the statistical area level 2. I won't go further into the technical details of these item creations and these estimates, but the link is there and please get in contact with me if you want to talk about it further. The indicators we've selected for this current study to assess community-level cultural connectedness is the Indigenous language use indicator, which looks at the percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents in each area who speak an Indigenous language in the home. And we've also looked at a multi-item composite index, which looks at cultural aspects of community social capital. So the percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents that attend ceremonies, cultural events, or access Indigenous-specific community services or health organisations, as well as the overall capacity and perceived ability to give and receive support within the community. We also examined community-level socioeconomic resources, community remoteness, as in distance from goods or services, And we also looked at the percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander residents in each area who reported they were discriminated against in the previous year. And the primary data source we used was the Queensland Suicide Register to calculate suicide rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people at the community level. So looking at the first level of results, you can see here that communities in which First Nations residents had greater involvement with cultural events, activities and attendance at cultural and Indigenous specific organisations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people died by suicide at a lower rate. It's interesting that social and cultural resources impacted suicide rates when you can see here that community level social and economic resources did not significantly influence Indigenous youth suicide mortality. And there's little difference based on communities with high or low levels of Indigenous language use. The most stark finding here, I would say, though, is that impact of discrimination, that communities in which more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people reported experiencing discrimination, more than 2.5 times as many Indigenous young people ended their lives by suicide. Supporting the individual level findings and community reports, of course, on the impact of racism on suicide risk for Indigenous peoples. So while the cultural social capital results are promising as protective against Indigenous suicide, I should acknowledge that this index includes variables which may be associated with other known protective factors which could explain the results. For example, engaging with more Indigenous specific services may just reflect that there are more services to engage with. Or greater support to give and receive support from community may reflect that there are more resources to give and receive. So in our next analyses, we wanted to determine if indicators of community-level cultural connectedness were protective against Indigenous suicide beyond possible correlations with other risk and protective factors, and if cultural connectedness at a community level possibly buffers against the known social and environmental risk factors for suicide. And this is particularly important in the current context, where there's considerable intercorrelations between our community-level risk and protective variables. As you can see here, the exception only being that socioeconomic resources and discrimination were not correlated at a community level. So we compared high and lower levels of cultural connectedness indicators in communities with the highest levels of social and environmental risk factors. So communities with the least socioeconomic resources, regional and remote areas, and communities with the most discrimination. And as you can see, in all of the areas with elevated community risk factors, higher Indigenous language use was associated with lower youth suicide rates. Even though, as you can remember, Indigenous language use had very little impact on communities' overall Indigenous youth suicide rates, suggesting that some cultural factors may have greater impact on young people in areas where there is greater disadvantage. And looking to your right, you can see that the greatest impact of both Indigenous language use at a community level and cultural social capital was in areas where more of the First Nations population reported discrimination, suggesting that the adverse impacts of discrimination may be particularly amenable to change through cultural interventions. And it's interesting because this confirms and supports what's been observed at an individual level, whereby positive cultural self-esteem and positive engagement with Indigenous identity buffered the effects of racism on adverse outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and children. So these results suggest that this buffering may occur as well at a community level, but also on actual suicide mortality. A key limitation in the findings to date is that these are observational associations and we can't infer causation. We need further applied research on changes on suicide rates over time in partnership with community cultural engagement and practice programs. Nonetheless, this provides evidence to support new approaches to Indigenous suicide prevention, including language rejuvenation, cultural engagement, and population-wide strategies to address racism as a key public health concern. I'd like to end by acknowledging that when we say this is new research, we know that this is not new research on these lands. The importance of cultural connection on youth development is well known through Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And elders and Indigenous scholars alike have long contended that cultural connection is protective and, in fact, is healing against the harms caused by colonisation. We'd like to say that this evidence supports and confirms what has been known here for millennia. Thank you for listening.